Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look into view binding because we're going to keep on using view binding from now on in the course. So far, we've only used find view by ID, and there is a better way around it if you want to get access to items in your user interface. And also, we're going to get rid of the action bar. So let's start with the action bar problem slash situation, because it's not really a problem. It's just something that we need to fix. And in the manifest, you can see that we are using the 7 minutes workout theme, and let's jump into it into our themes XML, where we can then change it to, well, from dark action bar to actually no action bar. Okay, and this will replace the action bar from, well, get rid of the action bar basically. So that's one thing. Let's run the application once again. You see how it's going to look now before, and now you see how it looks after. So we don't have this entire action bar here, which allows us to go back or whatever and says the name of the application and so forth. We don't have that anymore, and we don't need it. All right, and now let's look into view binding. Okay, because we are going to use view binding from now on. And in order to use view binding, we need to set a couple of things up. First of all, in the Gradle file for our app, we need to add the build settings. Here, Kotlin options, build types, and so forth. Inside of Android, we add build features, like so, where we need to use the curly brackets, like so, and say view binding true. All right, so we're basically saying we want to use view binding. We're activating it. Once done, we sync the file, so synchronize it, and now we can use view binding. Now inside of our main activity and in general inside of activities, we can now go ahead and use view binding. Therefore, how you go about it is you create a new variable, and let me get rid of this as well here, var binding colon, and then you use the name of the activity. So here, activity main binding. Okay, so activity main is the XML file name, and then you have the binding keyword. So that's generally how it works. This is automatically generated for each activity that you have. This activity is called main activity. So if you have an activity, for example, exercise activity, then it would be called activity exercise binding. All right. So now we need to make it a nullable and assign null to it. We need to import it as well. So let's import this class, and you will find that it's now available here under data binding, activity main binding. And this is the name that I have for my project, the directory for the project. So now we can use this binding. So instead of setting the content view in here, we're going to set the content view after preparing our binding object. So our binding object at this point is null, as you see, and we can use activity main binding and dot inflate in order to now use the layout inflator to inflate the XML file. So what it's going to do is it will basically prepare our binding object that we can now use it and say binding dot root here. So our set content view will now set it in a different way. So this was how it was set before, right? It's just set, okay, use activity main XML, which is still fine, but this is the view binding approach. So what basically happens is it says, use this XML file called activity main and inflate it with the layout inflator and store it inside of this binding object. And now use the root of this binding object, which is the main activities XML files root container, which is this constraint layout. Okay, so the constraint layout is the root of this entire binding object. But now what we can do is, instead of using the find view by ID approach like we did here, we can go ahead and use view binding instead. So let's set that up real quick. Therefore, we can just say binding dot fl start and dot set on click listener. Okay, so we don't need to create this variable anymore. We don't need to create any variable for our user interface items. We can directly access their IDs inside of this binding object. As you know, it contains this entire XML file which also contains the individual IDs. So we can now access the IDs directly, even though we need to use question marks because the binding object is a nullable and the frame layout is also a nullable. So at this point, we can go with it. So we are, well, you see, we don't have to do this stuff anymore, which we had to do quite a bit. And also, if we wanted to now use this frame layout outside of this method, of this onCreate method, we can still use Viewbinding. We don't have to set up this frame layout globally here at the top, for example, and then assign it inside of the onCreate method, and then we can only use it. No, we can now use it throughout the entire file using this approach here, which is very cool. Now, whenever you want to use Viewbinding in your project, really make sure that you also use the onDestroy method, where you set binding back to null. Okay, so use the standard approach of the onDestroy, but then also make sure that binding is reset to null. Otherwise, you might run into problems. Okay, so this is just a clean way to unassign the binding to avoid memory leak. Okay, so what is the purpose of Viewbinding? Well, the implementation is shorter and concise. It is faster and more efficient during compile time. It is the safer alternative because it ensures only the views in the connecting layout are being referenced. Because otherwise what could happen is, let's say we have an ID, we call it FL start, but then in another XML file we also have FL start, and then by accident we are accessing the wrong FL start, and this would crash our application. But now with Viewbinding we are making sure that we are only specifically accessing the items, the IDs of the file that fits to our XML, fits to our class. So our main activity has an XML assigned to it, and only of that XML we can now access the IDs, which we now do. Because find view by ID works throughout all files. It doesn't just work for this particular file. So if we had an FL start in another XML file that has nothing to do with our activity main, our application would crash. Okay, so these are a couple of good reasons, I believe, and this is also the recommended approach. So Viewbinding, how this whole thing is called, is the approach that Google recommends for you to use when it comes to applications that you're building from now on. Okay, so that was it for this video. In the next one, we are going to look at how to add the exercise screen and use intents and customizing our toolbar.